Our students are always giving us information about their engagement and their motivation levels during music class, but I wanted to know more about when upper elementary students are the most engaged and when they are the least engaged during music. So I asked them. And today we'll walk through what that process looked like from start to finish so that you can do this with your own students in your own school if you want. So in this study, I asked students about when they were the most interested in music class and when they were the least interested in music class. Then I analyzed that data. I came up with some core ideas that summarized the answer, and I turned that into a plan that I am going to implement next year. And that's what we'll walk through today. Now, this was not a formal study. It was not a project for my doctorate. It was not directed by the school in any way. This was just something that I wanted to do as a teacher, and I thought that you might be interested in it as well. Let's talk about this survey. A survey is how we're going to get this information from students. And this whole idea for this study was based off of a paper that I read from Christopher Roberts. And in that situation, the researcher was able to sit down and interview students individually. That was not the case for me, and it probably won't be the case for you either, just because of time constraints and the volume of students we have. So because of that limited amount of time, because we can't do individual interviews with students, a survey is a great way to get information from students all at one time. I had 4 prompts to this survey. I asked students to describe what we did in music class this year. I am most interested in music class when. I am least interested in music class when. And then, is there anything else that you want Miss Victoria to know? Now, I used a worksheet for this survey, but you could also do it electronically. If you do choose to use something like a Google form, that can be really helpful for the analysis process later, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, that said, sometimes students want to underline words, sometimes they want to draw pictures, sometimes they want to do little doodles on the side to kind of give some color to their answers. So depending on what kind of program you use, if you do decide to do this electronically, that can be kind of limiting. So that's just something to think about. I gave this survey at the very end of the year. It was part of how we wrapped up our last music class together. But that said, you can definitely do this activity, this project, anytime. And there's actually a really good argument, I think, for doing this at the beginning of the year or in the middle of the year, because then when you get the results from student data, you actually have time to implement whatever plan you've developed based on student responses. So if you're watching this in real time over the summer, then this can be something to keep in mind for the fall at the beginning of the year. You don't need to wait to the end of the year to do something like this. This is my second year doing this project, so I have some things that I have found to be helpful as I implement this survey. One of them is coming up with a big list of what we've done this year in music class. So this is a list that we all came up with together, and this is something like a list of activities or instruments that we played or music events or specific songs that students liked. The idea is it just kind of gets our brains wrapped around what the year has been like so far. I also found that if I wanted more information from students, I needed to kind of prompt them a little bit. So an example of something that I saw early on in the first time I did this survey was that students would say something like, I'm most interested in music class when we play games. And that was all they had to say. Well, that leaves me thinking, what games, right? What was it about those games that students liked? And if I were to interview students one-on-one, then I would be able to ask those kinds of follow-up questions. But we can't do that in a survey, right? So I just wanted to help students give me as much information as they could. And that's why I added some of these sentence prompts for students to use as they were writing. So a few of those sentence stems that I had on the board were things like because, or for example, or another reason is, or I also think that, or here's why, things like that, just to kind of get students to give a little bit more information. So now we have stacks of survey responses from students. What do we do with all of this information? How can we organize it and make sense of what students have shared with us? We're asking students for their opinions on music class so that we can act on the results of this survey. So having a gigantic stack of student responses that we can't go through or make any sense of because there are just too many papers to go through, right? That doesn't really serve us. It's an information overload as it stands right now, but it's not meaningful. I do read through every response from students and I do make notes about what I notice, but I don't go through this whole analysis process with that entire stack. Instead, we can choose one group of responses, and this is going to be our sample. So there are a couple different ways that we can do this. Maybe there is a particular grade level that we care about more than others, or maybe there's a specific class within that grade level that we care about. So you might take what you perceive to be your least engaged upper elementary class, or lower elementary class for that matter. And that's what happened with the study that this project is based off of. In that Christopher Roberts study, he chose his least engaged upper elementary music class. And we all have those classes, right? So I think that's a really good approach. You could also choose your most engaged class and your least engaged class, or you could go through your class rosters for a particular grade level and pick out who you perceive to be the 5 most engaged students and the 5 least engaged students from each class. And that becomes your sample. If you don't want to choose a specific group, you can also just randomly pick like 15 to 25-ish responses from a whole grade level. It just depends on what you want to know. It depends on your big picture purpose of the study. So for me, I just chose one upper elementary music class to do this whole process with. All right, now that we have a sample, let's get to the fun part. We get to go through and make meaning from all of these responses. Our process here is going to be to go through student responses and develop codes. Then we get to organize those codes into categories, and then we're going to develop those categories into themes. So just to set the scene here, qualitative data analysis can feel a little bit messy. It is an emergent process. It's an iterative process. It's not linear. That means that we can and we will go back through student answers a bunch of times, and we can also change our minds about how we want to organize the data as we go. Another thing to keep in mind is that in qualitative analysis, the researcher's perspective, our backgrounds, our opinions, all of those things, all of those are part of the data analysis frame. So there's not an illusion here that we are going to pretend to be objective or unbiased here. We have perspectives as the music teachers, and our perspectives are going to be a part of this analysis. And that means that 2 different researchers, 2 different music teachers can look at the same set of data and come up with 2 very different takeaways. And that's the fun thing about a project like this. It is very specific for our own classrooms, for our own teaching situations. And then the last thing to point out here is that since this process isn't linear, we're not going to finish the first phase of the analysis before we move on to the next one. These processes are going to get kind of mixed in all together, and you'll see what I mean when we jump in. Let's start with coding. Our first pass through when we read responses, we're going to create some codes. Codes are individual words or maybe very short phrases that stand out to us in student responses. So these are like the individual blocks, the individual units of students' experience in music class. Because if we were to just say music class, well, that's pretty broad, right? But if we were to say something a little bit more descriptive like recorder, jumping, boring, frog in the meadow. Those give us some color about what students experience when they experience music class. And there are a few different ways to go through coding qualitative data. The coding process that I like to use is called Invivo coding, which just means that we're using words that students use themselves to describe what music is like. Invivo is Latin for in the living. So with Invivo coding, it just means that we're taking quotes from students' lived experiences. Now, here's a list of words that I pulled from student responses. These are my codes that I pulled from the survey. And you can see there's a good amount here. I have activities, we have dance, informants, mustache song, we have singing, sound trap was a big one. We could make anything we wanted. These are some examples of some of the codes that I came up with when I went through student responses. Codes are really simple to come up with if we are paying attention to our core research questions, to what we want to know, and if we're paying attention to our own thought process as we go through student responses. So as we're reading, if something a student says strikes us as significant or particularly salient or important, or it comes up more than once, we're just going to write that down and it becomes a code. And as we are noticing these words, as we are reading through student responses, if we have a thought or a connection or an image or something that comes to mind, that gets memoed. So here is, just as an example, here's the spreadsheet that I have for this project. I have the grade level and student names on the left-hand side, which I'm not showing here, and then each research question, the code, and my memo. So I noticed things like, in this response, flutes, recorder, flutes, ukulele, and xylophone all seemed important in this student's response. So I wrote those down as codes, but also those are all instruments, right? So I have a little comment here just to myself that this can be easily summarized or condensed with the word instruments. And that is getting a little bit more into our next step of this process, which is what I mean when I say that it's not linear. It is kind of all meshed in together. And earlier I was talking about doing this with a worksheet like I did or something like a Google form. And this is where it makes sense to do something electronic for student surveys, because then you can just copy and paste words and phrases into a list of codes. I was transcribing all of these by hand and it took a little bit longer. Now, that said, you don't have to use a spreadsheet. You could also write on, if you're using a worksheet, you could also write on the worksheet itself. You could take a colored pencil and circle student words. You could highlight them. You could write notes to yourself in the margins. You could use a sticky note on each page. There are lots of ways to do this. For now, the idea is that in our first pass through student responses, we're going to make a note of the words that students use themselves to describe their experience with music class. And these are our codes. Johnny Saldana describes categories as things that look alike and feel alike. So categories help us group several different codes together when we notice a pattern or just things that seem like they go together. When I did this in my spreadsheet, I had a list of codes in alphabetical order, and then I just started copying and pasting codes into groups on the right. For me, visually seeing these codes broken down by category like this was really helpful for this process. In other situations, I've also gone through a Google Doc of a word-for-word transcript of participant interviews, and I've highlighted those with different colors to show different categories. So if we were doing that here, all of the mentions of instruments might get a blue highlight. And when students reference being physically active, I might highlight that as pink. So again, there are several different ways to do this. And sometimes in this process, there is a group of codes that we know how to label right away, like instruments. That's pretty straightforward, or it was to me. But sometimes there are things that feel like they go together, but we're not sure how. And if that's the case, we can still put them together anyway, and then we just come up with a title with a label for them later on. And since this process is iterative, it might also mean that we go back through student responses and we might add more codes to our list, because now that we're categorizing them, we might realize that there was something important in a student response that maybe we didn't pick up on the first time. So eventually we have a list of categories. Here is what I have for mine. Things like choice, media and actions. I have physically active, songs, there's technology, there's talking, things like that. And again, if another teacher were to go through these same exact student responses, they would probably come up with a different set of codes and categories. And that makes sense because we are all different people. We're all bringing a different perspective to these student responses. And then from there, I looked at these categories by research question. And for the purpose of this video, I am just going to look at the prompts for when students were the most interested and when they were the least interested in music class. So questions 2 and 3 in that survey. And the reason I decided to separate these categories by research question is that one code can have two different affects, two different meanings, depending on the student perspective. So an example is rhythm sticks. Some responses said that they were most interested in music class when we played things like rhythm sticks. But then there's other responses. Someone said that they're least interested in music class when we use rhythm sticks because we are just scratching them together. Same thing with singing. Singing and doing body percussion was a least interested response, but songs like the Mustache song, which by the way is singing and body percussion, that was also listed as one of the most interested responses. And then same thing with ukuleles. They came up over and over and over again in this survey about one of students' favorite things from music class. But when we look at why, someone said that it was fun because we got to make our own music with ukulele. And then another response said that someone didn't enjoy ukulele because we didn't get to make our own rhythms and instead we had to repeat strumming patterns back. So that tells me that there is something important here. In these examples, rhythm sticks, singing and body percussion, ukulele, those are all codes, but they represent different things about student experiences. So over here on the left, I have the categories, and at the top, I have the research questions that I'm showing for the purpose of this video. And then in the cells, that's where I've listed my codes. And I like this because it lets me see the data a little bit more at a glance. Our last step here is to move the categories into themes. A theme is an extended idea that kind of summarizes student perspectives. It kind of tells a story. It gives a bigger picture, a phrase, a bigger picture sentence to some of these categories. So if we step back and we squint at these categories, which of them feel like they go together? So here's what I came up with. Students are most interested in music class when they have agency. And under this, I have put choice and technology, things like Soundtrap or Chrome Music Lab. Technology and choice were paired together for me because in all of the mentions of why students enjoyed technology, they all cited the creative element with it, that creative choice element with it. Next, students are the most interested in music class when we actively use multiple media, especially instruments. So under this category, I have instruments, physically active, more interest, and then specific songs. So musical actions, things that are more physically active and more interesting, and then specific songs and games were all kind of similar in my mind because these to me suggest that we are doing something. These are musical actions. Now, on the flip side, students are least interested in music class when they perceive a lack of choice. So under this, I have instruments and lack of choice. When the students described being least interested in music class in relation to instruments, it was always because they didn't have a choice in what to play. Those were all convergent activities. So instruments and lack of choice for this research question, they went together in my mind. And that makes sense to me. That was not a big surprise. The next two themes I played around with quite a bit. So students are least interested in music class when activities are passive. And under that, I put talking and then physically inactive and less interested. What and I think maybe many other music teachers might find ironic is that the times that students mentioned talking, it was in reference to it being when they were the least interested in music. And my interpretation of this is that even though upper elementary students are going to talk no matter what, it's not actually how they would prefer to be spending their time in music class. And then from these responses, I'm also reminded that I definitely need to keep my own talking brief as well. So students were least interested when activities were outside their ZDP, their zone of proximal development, and when my pacing of activities was too slow. And I know the activities that students are talking about here, and I distinctly remember thinking at the time that I needed to pause that activity and come back to it another day. And I didn't. and they noticed. So monotonous pacing and ZDP go together in my mind because this is just for me. When I sense that an activity is too challenging for some students, I want to give those students more time to practice, right? But that also means that if I am not intentional, if I'm not aware of what I'm doing, I can fall into the trap of repeating an activity too many times and then extending that portion of the lesson so I can get more students on board in terms of skill level. And that came into play when we were working on ukuleles, and I spent too much time with echoing up and down patterns, and I can see that reflected here. So taken all together, I have some helpful themes that describe how students experience music class. When I look at these themes, all I see are curricular and instructional actions that I can take, or curricular and instructional actions that I can change. So there's a structural piece here to me and an instructional piece. Structural pieces are like the curriculum activity themselves, how music class is organized and what we do in each lesson segment. Instructional pieces to me are how I go about facilitating that curriculum. That is my pacing and my delivery and my scaffolding process for individual activities. So thinking about my takeaways here, I'm going to use the keep doing, stop doing, start doing framework for this. So keep doing. All of the keep doing things I see as curricular pieces. This upcoming year, I am going to keep giving students choice in our classroom activities. All grades respond really well to choice, but it is not surprising to me that upper elementary students especially were most interested when they felt like they had some agency. I can also add even more opportunities for student choice in the lessons themselves. And since I write the curriculum that we use in these classes, that is very easy. I will also keep an emphasis on multiple media like singing and playing instruments and speaking and moving because that was really successful. And then I'm going to make sure that I keep making our activities physically active, as physically active as possible, and keep choosing songs and games that have musical actions, like physical games, singing games, things like that. And again, the curriculum activities themselves all had these pieces built in. So that's going to be an easy thing for me to keep and then write in even more ways to keep things active. So looking at these themes, my interpretation is that the curriculum that I write for this age group is, by and large, successful and engaging. And that is great because it gives me something to work with and kind of expand on next year. Next, stop and start doing. These struck me more as instructional delivery practices, specifically about my pacing. So this coming year, I am going to stop spending too much time on convergent activities. There are lots of areas where students don't have choice in music class. They don't choose when they will come to class. They don't choose who their teacher is. They don't choose, very strictly speaking, they don't choose the learning objectives for the day or what repertoire we're going to use to get to those learning objectives. When students do have choice, which they do, when they do have choice, it is within the parameters that I set as the teacher, right? Now, that said, students really notice when I hang out too long on a convergent activity. So for me, again, this is information about my pacing. I'm also going to start looking for opportunities where I am letting a little bit too much downtime sneak in the form of having students talk to each other for too long, or in the form of me talking at students too long. Normally when I have students do a turn and talk moment, there is a curricular reason for that, but sometimes I also use it as a time that I go grab something from another place in the room and I set it up for the next activity. So if I am more prepared and think through the flow of my lesson, I know I can cut this time back. I can also direct students to do something else, like start the singing game that we are about to do, or I can have students set up that next activity themselves. And same thing with me talking. There are so many ways that I can cut back on how much verbal instruction I give, like thinking through how I want to word directions ahead of time. I can put instructions on the board. I can use more nonverbal modeling instead of speaking everything. I feel confident that I can cut back my amount of teacher talk. And along those lines, I am also going to stop dragging activities out. I will try to stop dragging activities out, and I will start being more intentional about sticking to my start and stop times in my lesson. I have a goal number of minutes in my activities for each slot in the lesson plan. And I know that sounds really type A, but I actually write down those mile markers specifically because of this tendency that I have to drag an activity out. And these students have noticed that. So purposefully stopping an activity, even when there are things that I would still like to fix, that's something that I can do better about next year. So on some level, data analysis always feels a little bit incomplete, and that's because it is. We could go back through student responses, we could take another pass at this data and maybe find something else that we didn't notice. Or we could add another upper elementary class to this and maybe get a little bit more color, maybe add some new themes here, things like that. But I think that just pausing here, we have some things that we can work with. And now I have some sentences, some themes that I can use to kind of frame the year and reflect on student experiences. And then I also have some specific actions that I'm going to take as a result of these student responses. So this is a way to take a big pile of qualitative student data and turn it into some action steps for next year. Students are always giving us information about their engagement level and what types of activities they enjoy. I like this framework, this project, because it lets us intentionally ask students for their perspectives in a way that is manageable and action-oriented for us, in a way that we can make meaning out of. Now, a big takeaway from this study was how much students enjoyed physical movement and action-based games. So if you want examples of the types of singing games that increase engagement with this upper elementary age group, you can watch the next video coming up about upper elementary singing games.